So today I want to speak with you about some of the context of the themes of childbirth and child rearing in Northanger Abbey and Frankenstein. Perhaps the first thing to think about is that in Britain, children were born, all children were born into a system of property inheritance that was governed by the practices of primogeniture, gavelkind, and also the old Roman law of coverture. Under primogeniture, property, titles, and their attendant political power were passed from father until oldest son. And so families could consolidate wealth from generation to generation by passing property down completely from generation to generation. Under the practice of gavelkind, which was in use in County Kent as well as in parts of Wales, property tended to be divided evenly between all of the male siblings. So in this sense, property is divided up and families cannot consolidate wealth in quite the same ways. You'll notice too that these are property mechanisms that apply only to male children. As the critic Susan Staves has shown, female property was not unknown during this period, but it was very rare when compared to male property under primogeniture and gavelkind. Typically, under the Roman law of coverture, a woman's legal personhood, along with all of her property interests, was subsumed under her husband after her marriage. So primogeniture and gavelkind, systems that absolutely required a pure male bloodline from father to son, had profound effects on women's sexuality during this period. Pure male bloodlines, that is, required women's chastity before their marriages and sexual fidelity to their husbands inside of the institution. Married women who did not adhere to these sexual mores could expose their family estates to inheritance by children who did not belong to their husbands. As James Boswell put it, we hang a thief for stealing a sheep, but the unchastity of a woman transfers sheep and farm and all from the right owner. Women's sexual infidelity could, in some cases, even be grounds for divorce. Unmarried women who did not adhere to these sexual norms could compromise their own worth on the marriage market by giving birth to children outside of wedlock or by earning a social reputation for sexual promiscuity. Sometimes called fallen women, women who committed adultery, were aligned in the public imagination with prostitutes, as in this 1792 pamphlet on the evils of adultery and prostitution. Women who had sex outside of marriage were thus socially stigmatized, but some commentators noted that they were the victims of an economic system in which women did not have regular opportunities to own property or earn wages in socially acceptable ways. Because of these customs of property ownership and inheritance in Britain, primogeniture, gavelkind, and coverture, the biological sex of babies was vitally important to British social structures and, by extension, its culture. And we may imagine ourselves to be very different from these Georgians, but these images of contemporary gender reveal parties tell us a lot about current beliefs that a baby's biological sex tell us about that individual person's future. So we're kind of like the Georgians in this sense, but we're also kind of different. Complicating all of these matters still further is that birth was incredibly dangerous for Georgian-era mothers and their babies. Estimates from England and Wales indicate a maternal mortality rate peaking at 17 per 1,000 live births in the late 17th century. Over the following century, the rate almost halved, and then it halved again by 1825, or 4.7 per 1,000. Infant infant mortality rates, or the number of deaths during the first year of life per 1,000 live births, were probably in the range of 200 to 300 in medieval Europe. And they would not significantly decline in Western countries until the very early 20th century, when medical advancements like sterile birthing rooms would make birth a much less dangerous event. Particularly relevant in the case of Frankenstein is the story of Mary Shelley's birth, which some of you may know. Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, was delivered of her daughter by an experienced midwife, Mrs. Bleckenstop, which William Godwin recorded in his journal, the excerpt of which you can see there. After the birth, William Godwin called a physician, Dr. Poingard, to deliver Mary Wollstonecraft of the placenta. Dr. Poingard is believed to have come to Mary Wollstonecraft's delivery room from a post-mortem examination without washing his hands, introducing the infection that would kill Mary Wollstonecraft several days later. Mary Shelley also faced a number of reproductive tragedies in her own life. By the time Frankenstein was being adapted to the London stage in 1823, Mary Shelley had buried 3 of her 4 children, and she also had suffered an additional miscarriage. And so when we think about the introduction to Northanger Abbey in this line about Catherine Morland's mother and how she has miraculously lived beyond the births of her children, we might tend to read that in our contemporary moment as a kind of satire, but there is a degree of the very real and the very dangerous nature of childbirth embedded in this particular sentence. Until the late 18th and early 19th centuries, women giving birth were under the care of other women who would aid in labor, delivery, and recovery, often for weeks after the baby was born. These women, who were called gossips during the medieval period and midwives thereafter, presided almost universally over birthing rooms in Britain. However, with the increasing professionalization of medicine during the 18th century came a new figure, or the man midwife, a physician who trained in medical school to deliver women of their babies. These man midwives, like William Smellie, that was his name, they developed birthing manuals, like the image you see here. This was a typical image from those manuals, and also birthing instruments like the forceps. So when we think about the passage from Frankenstein, right before the creature's animation, when Victor Frankenstein talks about gathering the instruments of life around him, we can think about him as a kind of analog to these male midwives who used instruments to deliver women of their babies. And because birth was so dangerous and because the sources of infection were not known during this period, the presence of a man midwife in a delivery room was often a sign of emergency, tragedy, and ultimately often resulted in the death of the baby or the mother. So this is not necessarily a positive series of images in Georgian era Britain. Whether British mothers died in childbirth or were absent for some other reason, the theme of motherlessness is one that Austen and Shelley explore persistently in Northanger Abbey and Frankenstein with a variety of family situations, whether this is the Tilneys, the Frankensteins, or the absolute motherlessness of Victor Frankenstein's creature. But these families without mothers were not just the stuff of fiction. As the critic Ruth Perry notes, when mothers were absent from the home, children, especially female children, were exposed to domestic violence and sexual victimization, often by their older male relatives. For example, Elizabeth Jeffreys was raped by her stepfather, John Swan, when her mother, a domestic, was away from home for work. Elizabeth Jeffreys would later murder Swan to stop this abuse. This particular kind of threat inside the home instead of outside the home is one of the key features of Gothic fiction in the Anglophone tradition. As a pamphlet said of the real-life conditions of Elizabeth Jeffreys, "What a shudder must humane nature receive when it recollects there is no place where security may be depended upon. But at the same time, persons are barring doors from thieves without, they are enclosing worse enemies within. Nay, the nearest ties of kindred are no security." And this is something that is bared out in Northanger Abbey persistently with the way that Catherine Morland thinks about General Tony. In addition to these complex details about childbirth and its meanings during the period, the 19th century also showed remarkable change in the way childhood was imagined in Britain. Older models of childhood stressed the power of original sin in the moral formation of children. The idea that as natural sinners, children had to be reformed by education that would provide models for Christian behavior. Hannah More, for example, stressed in her writing the importance of improving the habits and raising the principles of common people. And John Newberry's A Little Pretty Pocketbook sought to inculcate children into virtuous living. Researchers at the British Library have shown that this book was originally sold with a pincushion for girls or a small ball for boys, and one half of the sphere was black and the other was red, and you were to put a pin in the black side of the cushion for all of your bad deeds and a pin in the red side of the cushion for all your good deeds. And the title page of the book guaranteed to infallibly make Tommy a good boy and Polly a good girl. So all you parents out there, invest in a pincushion. Other commentators, however, like the poets William Blake and William Wordsworth, began to think about childhood as a special period of innocence and other kinds of spiritual and moral knowledge that diminished as the child grew older. In this sense, adults had much to learn from children instead of the other way around. The critic, Michael Phillips, has argued that we can actually see this change in the title pages of A Free Little Pocketbook and William Blake's Songs of Innocence. If you look at the children in A Pretty Little Pocketbook, you can see that the woman in this image is reading to them, as opposed to Blake's engraving, in which the children seem to be holding the book and reading to the adult, right? So these shifts in the imagination of childhood are registered at the level of these images. William Blake also pioneered the idea of a child narrator, which is something that Mary Shelley examines at length in the creature's narrative in Frankenstein. During the period of Austen and Shelley's lifetimes, a number of theories of childhood education were influential in Britain, and they tended to focus on the nature of the child's mind or the political system into which children were born. John Locke reckoned, for example, that children were blank slates that had to be formed by education and experience. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued by distinction that children were born innocent, and that was their originary state. Other commentators, like Mary Shelley's parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, thought about the political systems into which children were born, particularly in Britain. Because William Godwin believed that people were fundamentally formed by the systems of government in which they lived, he extrapolated that children in the womb could receive impressions from the external environment and thus be born with their characters almost fully formed in accordance with the government system in which they lived. Mary Wollstonecraft, by distinction, thought about the different kinds of education that children encountered based on their biological sex. Specifically, she focused on the ways that girls were tyrannized by their educations and by their parents in domestic situations that would translate after their marriage into a kind of tyranny in their own homes. So because we are studying novels so intently, it's also critical to note the ways that this genre was imagined as a mode for exploring the process of individual development of the individual. A literary expression of the German concept of Bildung, or the growth and development of the individual. The Bildungsroman is a term for a novel about an individual's psychological growth from infancy to adulthood. Northanger Abbey and Frankenstein each engage the problems of individual development inside of this literary tradition. Finally, it's important to remember that any time we are speaking about childbirth or child rearing, we are engaged in an act of imagining the future, not just of the individual, but of the nation, of which that individual will one day be an adult citizen. And it's so in this sense, we can perhaps trace a very long historical, we can trace a very long historical arc from the novels of Mary Shelley and Jane Austen to the contemporary media fascination with the miraculous postpartum appearances. Anybody who has ever had a baby will know how miraculous that is. These appearances of Kate Middleton and her children, who are quite literally in line to be Britain's future kings and queens. Thank you.